The summer air of 1856 hung heavy over the Georgia lowlands, thick with the hum of cicadas and the smell of scorched earth. The nation was preparing for its grandest celebration, the 4th of July, a day of flags, speeches, and fireworks proclaiming liberty. But on a remote plantation, far from the brass bands and parades, liberty was nothing more than a rumor whispered on the wind. Among the rows of cotton and the shadows of the slave quarters lived Joseph Carter, a man born in chains and silence. He had no papers, no rights, no name beyond the one forced on him, yet his eyes carried something the overseers could not whip away, a quiet, watchful fire. While the grand house glittered with chandeliers and polished silver, Joseph's world was dirt floors, cracked hands, and nights filled with muffled cries. He rarely spoke, but he saw everything. Beyond the field stood an ancient oak tree, its branches stretching like the arms of something older than kings or empires. To others, it was only wood and shade. To Joseph, it was the only place that did not belong to anyone. Under its silent canopy, he let himself imagine, just for a breath, that he was free. The sun over the Mississippi Delta did not rise gently for Joseph Carter. It tore through the morning fog like a blade, burning away the last traces of coolness, announcing another day of chains and commands. Every dawn came with the same metallic clang of iron shackles, the same guttural shouts of the overseer, and the same hollow ache in Joseph's chest. He had once dreamed, though he could no longer remember the details, of something beyond the endless cotton rows. But dreams were dangerous things here. They made the lash cut deeper. The first sound of the day was always the whip. It cracked like lightning, a sharp report that scattered the crows from the fence posts. The overseer took pride in it, in how he could slice the air and then flesh with the same effortless flick. Joseph would watch him from the corner of his eye while bending low over the cotton stalks, trying to move faster, trying not to be the one who caught the whip's kiss that morning. But there was no safety. Even when Joseph's hands blurred with speed, even when his shoulders screamed with effort, the whip came. It came not because of mistakes, but because the overseer wanted to remind them they were property. Pain was not punishment here, it was policy. By noon, Joseph's shirt clung to his back with sweat and blood. The air was so thick it felt like he was swallowing the sun itself. He would glance at the others, men and women with hollowed eyes, faces carved down to bone, and see only quiet surrender. They had learned to hide their agony, to fold it away somewhere deep where the overseer could not reach. Joseph tried to do the same, but the fire inside him kept flickering. It was small and dangerous, like an ember trapped in dry grass, and he feared if the overseer ever saw it in his eyes he would stamp it out. The overseer, Mr. Gable, had a talent for cruelty that bordered on artistry. He called it teaching, though it was closer to sport. He would invent games, twisted, humiliating contests meant to pit the enslaved against one another. Sometimes he made them race barefoot across broken glass bottles for a scrap of cornbread. Sometimes he forced two boys to fight while he sipped whiskey in the shade, grinning as their knuckles split open. Once, when Joseph refused to strike an older man who could barely stand, Gable tied Joseph to the oak tree and left him in the sun for 2 days without water. The ants found him first. By the second night, he could feel his heartbeat fluttering like a moth in a jar, and he wondered if death might be a mercy. But death did not come. Only morning did, and the whip with it. In the silence between lashes, Joseph learned how to disappear. He learned how to keep his face blank, how to fold his screams inward until they became something else, something private, wordless, and hard as stone. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. He moved like a shadow among the rows, either here nor gone. To the others, it seemed he had surrendered. But inside, in the place where the overseer could not reach, he was carving out something new, a quiet resolve. He would endure, not because he had hope. Hope was too fragile, too easily crushed, but because endurance itself felt like defiance. Every breath he drew without permission was a small rebellion. Still, there were nights when the silence was unbearable. After the others had collapsed into restless sleep, Joseph would sit awake beneath the stars, staring at the silhouette of the oak tree on the hill. It loomed over the fields like a watchtower, its thick limbs sprawling like black veins against the sky. He hated it. The overseer had hung men from its branches before, left them dangling as warnings. The tree remembered everything. When the wind passed through its leaves, it sounded like whispers, like voices trapped and restless. Sometimes Joseph thought he could hear them calling his name. He wondered if anyone remembered he existed. He had no papers, no surname anyone cared about. The world beyond the plantation might as well have been on the moon. Yet, something inside him, a memory, a phantom of freedom, would not die. It rose up every time the whip cracked, every time the overseer's laughter rang out like broken glass. It rose, and it burned, and it would not let him rest. Joseph began to keep count, not of days, which bled into each other like spilled ink, but of scars. Each new welt on his back was another mark in the ledger of what had been taken from him. His name, his dignity, his humanity. But the more they marked him, the more he felt that ember inside grow hot. They were trying to break him into pieces small enough to own. And somehow, through the agony and the chains and the endless sky that offered no mercy, Joseph decided he would not break. He would bend, he would bleed, but he would not shatter. By the end of that summer, the overseer's games no longer brought him pleasure. He saw it in Gable's eyes, the frustration when Joseph refused to cry out, when he stood silent and still as the whip cut open his skin. Pain no longer fed their power over him. It only fed the fire. And though Joseph said nothing, though he never lifted his head when spoken to, something had shifted. The others saw it too. In the nights when the moonlight painted their faces silver, they whispered about it. About the man who would not break. About Joseph Carter, who carried fire in his eyes. And somewhere deep in his bones, Joseph began to wonder, not if he could escape, not if he could survive, but if one day he could make the oak tree remember a different story. For months, Joseph Carter had moved like a shadow across the fields, silent, obedient, invisible. The overseer believed he had been broken. Even the other slaves had begun to see him as hollow, as someone who had buried his will beneath layers of scars and silence. But deep inside Joseph, beneath the ashes of despair, something had survived. A spark. It flickered faintly at first, almost imperceptible, like the glow of a coal buried in cold embers. And then, one day, it caught fire. It happened on a sweltering afternoon when the air itself seemed to sag under the weight of heat. The cotton fields were white and endless, and the sun hammered down like a punishment. Joseph was bent low, his hands moving with automatic rhythm, when a boy stumbled in the next row over. The boy could not have been more than 12. He was new, brought from another plantation just a week ago. He collapsed, face first, into the dust. For a moment, everything went still. And then Gable's boots thundered across the dirt. The overseer did not shout at first. He smiled, that thin, sharp smile Joseph had learned to dread, and drew his whip from his belt as if he were unsheathing a sword. The boy did not even raise his head. Gable lashed him once, twice, 3 times, each crack like a gunshot, each strike tearing open skin. Joseph stood frozen. Around him, the others kept picking, eyes averted, their bodies rigid with fear. They had learned long ago, to intervene was to invite death. But Joseph's hands had stopped moving. His breath came ragged. The boy's screams echoed inside him like the cries of a child he almost remembered being. That old ember of defiance roared back to life, and for the first time in years, Joseph lifted his head. His eyes locked on the overseer's face, and something passed between them, something wordless and electric. Gable saw it, and he hated it. The lash came for Joseph then, without warning, slashing across his chest. The pain was blinding, white-hot, but Joseph didn't flinch. Another strike, then another. He stood upright. Tall, blood streaming down his torso, his eyes never leaving the overseer's. By the 4th blow, Gable's grin faltered. By the 6th, his breath had grown ragged. And Joseph, though trembling with pain, felt something extraordinary. He felt unafraid. That beating became the turning point. Not because it was the worst, though it was, but because Joseph realized he could endure it and remain whole. They could break his flesh, But they could not touch the core of him unless he gave it to them. He would not give it. That night, as he lay in the dirt shack staring at the cracked ceiling boards, his body throbbing with agony, he made a decision. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, absolute. He would stop surviving. He would start fighting. At first, the idea terrified him. Rebellion was suicide. No slave had ever defied Gable and lived. The oak tree had seen to that. Yet Joseph found himself staring at that tree every night now, watching how its limbs cut black shapes into the moonlight. It was where Gable displayed his power, his cruelty, his certainty that no one would ever rise against him. Joseph imagined something else, the overseer's body hanging from those same branches, swaying gently in the night breeze. The thought chilled him, and fed him. The plan began to take shape slowly, almost against his will. He studied Gable the way a hunter studies prey, memorizing his habits, his rhythms, the moments when arrogance made him careless. Gable drank heavily at night. He walked the rows at dusk, alone, carrying only his whip. He kept the keys to the armory shack on his belt. Joseph catalogued each detail like a merchant counting coins. By day, he played the part of the broken man. He lowered his eyes, bowed his shoulders, limped when Gable watched. But behind that mask, his mind sharpened like a blade. He began whispering to two of the strongest field hands during the pre-dawn hours when even the crows were still asleep. They listened in silence, faces blank. He did not ask for trust. He asked only one question. "Do you want to die standing up or kneeling down?" They said nothing, but they kept listening. That was enough. For the first time, Joseph began to feel time differently. Days no longer blurred together. Each one became a step, a stone in the path leading towards something monumental. The beatings no longer hollowed him out, they hardened him. Every lash, every drop of blood, felt like an investment in the future he meant to build. And though he spoke none of this aloud, something in his presence changed. The others saw it. They caught glimpses of fire in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The boy who had been whipped into the dust now shadowed Joseph like a younger brother, his gaze bright with something dangerously close to hope. Gable noticed the change too. He watched Joseph more closely now, suspicion tightening his features. But arrogance dulled his instincts. He still believed Joseph was too broken to fight. That belief would kill him. By the end of that month, Joseph had chosen the night. A night with no moon, when the air would be thick and the darkness absolute. The oak tree would be the stage. He would not run. He would not flee north. He would take the place of fear and turn it into a monument. He would make the earth remember his name. As he lay in the straw that last night before the storm, Joseph closed his eyes. Pain burned through his body, but beneath it, something stronger pulsed. It was not hope. Hope could be stolen. It was not rage. Rage could be spent. It was resolve, cold and clean as iron. He had been a shadow long enough. Tomorrow, he would become fire. The night came wrapped in silence, thick and suffocating as wool. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. A storm had rolled through the Georgia lowlands earlier that evening, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, like the world itself was waiting. The moon had vanished behind heavy clouds, and the air was black and slick, carrying the damp scent of wet earth and old wood. It was the kind of darkness that made men whisper, the kind that buried sound before it could escape your lips. Joseph Carter rose from the straw in his shack without a word. Every joint in his body ached, but inside him there was only steel now. He moved like a man underwater, slow, deliberate, invisible. His two silent allies stirred from the corners, eyes glinting faintly in the dark. No words passed between them. Words were fragile things, and tonight required something stronger than words. They slipped out into the yard, barefoot on mud, their bodies swallowed by the black. The big house loomed in the distance, its windows cold and blind. Beyond it, the fields stretched endlessly, pale shapes of cotton glowing faintly in the gloom. The oak tree rose on the far side like a black crown against the sky. Its branches curled and nodded, thick as a man's waist, reaching into the night as if to claw at the clouds. Gable was in his quarters, drunk, as Joseph had counted on. The man had spent the evening boasting over bourbon with the plantation foreman, laughing too loud, slamming his fist on the table, declaring that fear was the only leash a man like Joseph understood. By midnight, the foreman had gone. Gable had stayed, slumped in his chair, boots up, the whip coiled on the table like a sleeping serpent. Joseph waited at the doorway until the man's snores came steady, deep, careless. Then he stepped inside. The room stank of liquor and sweat. A lantern burned low, casting a faint golden pool on the floorboards, everything beyond swallowed by shadow. Joseph's heartbeat was so loud it seemed to shake his bones. His hands did not tremble. He had wrapped them in strips of cloth to silence his grip. He took the keys from Gable's belt with the care of a thief opening a coffin. The man didn't stir. Then Joseph reached for the whip. His fingers brushed the leather, warm from the room, and for an instant, memories screamed through him like fire. The lash, the blood, the cries of children. His vision blurred. Rage rose like a tidal wave, and he forced it back down. Rage was loud. Tonight required silence. He raised the whip slowly, coiling it around his arm to keep it from snapping. Then he moved behind Gable and pressed the loop around the man's throat. Gable jerked awake, eyes bulging, fumbling for breath. Joseph pulled tight. The man thrashed violently, the chair splintering beneath him, boots hammering the floor. The lantern rocked, throwing mad shadows across the walls. Joseph's arms burned like they were being torn from their sockets, but he held on. He locked his jaw and stared into Gable's panicked eyes, and for the first time, Joseph felt nothing, no pity, no fear, no hesitation. Only purpose. The struggle was brutal and short. Gable's face darkened, his legs kicked once, then stilled. When the body went slack, Joseph kept pulling until the last tremor passed. Then silence returned, deeper now, absolute. He let the body slump to the floor, the whip still biting its neck like a final insult. Outside, the night had turned colder. A wind slid low across the fields, carrying the faint rattle of dry leaves. Joseph and the two others dragged Gable's body through the mud, every step sinking heavy. They didn't speak. Their breaths steamed pale in the darkness. When they reached the oak tree, they stopped. The tree was monstrous up close, its bark gnarled and split like old bone. Joseph ran a hand across it, feeling its cold strength. It had seen generations of cruelty. It had been Gable's stage, his throne of terror. Tonight, it would become his gallows. They worked with mechanical precision. One man climbed the lower branch, looping the rope Joseph had hidden there days before. Another tied the knot, his hands quick and sure. Joseph positioned the body beneath the branch. Gable's head lolled, his eyes half open, glassy. Joseph tightened the noose and paused. For a moment, he looked into that slack, lifeless face, searching for something, an answer, a fragment of the fear Gable had carved into so many others. There was nothing. Only a hollow husk where arrogance had once lived. They hoisted him up. The rope creaked. The body rose, slow and jerking, until it hung still against the black sky, boots dangling inches above the dirt. The wind whispered through the leaves, and the branches shivered like they were laughing. Joseph stepped back. His chest rose and fell steady, controlled. He expected triumph, but what came was something colder, silence, vast and echoing. It was done. The monster was dead. The tree that had once borne witness to their suffering now bore their revenge. He stood there a long time, staring at the silhouette swaying gently against the clouds. He thought of the boy in the fields, of the hollow eyes of the others, of all the nights spent waiting to die. Something inside him uncoiled. Not joy, not even relief, just the absence of fear. Then, without a word, he turned away. The first hint of dawn was bleeding into the horizon, faint and gray. Joseph knew this was not freedom. Not yet. But it was the first true breath he had ever taken. And as the cold light touched his face, he let it burn away the last of his chains. The tone captures chaos, fear, and relentless pursuit. Joseph becomes both hunter and hunted, yet remains unbroken. Morning came like a blade. The first light cracked over the horizon, cold and pale, spilling across the fields that had once been Gable's kingdom. Dew clung to the cotton like beads of glass. The oak tree stood black against the newborn sun, and from its highest branch swayed the overseer's body, limp and twisted, boots gently knocking each other with every breath of wind. It was one of the younger boys who found him. He came running barefoot across the yard, voice strangled, eyes wide with the kind of terror that only comes from seeing a god fall. Within minutes, the big house had erupted. Doors slammed. Boots hammered the wooden floors. Voices barked orders through the dawn mist. The dogs woke howling, and by the time the sun fully rose, the plantation was no longer a place of routine. It was a nest of hornets ripped open. Men with rifles stormed the slave quarters, shouting, overturning straw beds, tearing through buckets and crates, searching for any trace of the hands who'd done it. They dragged men and women out by the arms, lining them in the mud, demanding names. No one spoke. The air trembled with the weight of that silence. Fear clawed through the white men like fire through dry grass. They had believed in the permanence of their order, in the invisible wall of terror that kept their world intact. Now that wall had cracked, and they could not stop looking at the hole. Some whispered that the devil himself had come for Gable. Others swore it had been Carter. The name passed from mouth to mouth like a curse. Joseph Carter, they said, in the way a man says the name of a storm that drowned his house. The very sound of it set their jaws tight and their hands twitching toward their guns. Joseph, meanwhile, was already gone. He had slipped into the swamp just before dawn, silent as breath, vanishing into the tangle of black cypress and hanging moss. Water closed over his feet, cold and slick, and mosquitoes rose in angry clouds around his face. The mud sucked at his steps, slowing him, trying to pull him back, but Joseph pushed on. Behind him, the plantation roared. The dogs were loosed. Their howls rose high and sharp across the marsh, closer every minute. Joseph's heart thundered, but not from fear. He was beyond fear now. He felt stripped to something elemental, bone, will, breath. He thought of Gable's body swaying in the gray light, and a grim calm settled over him. Whatever came next, he would not crawl back. He would rather die upright in the mud than kneel again in the dust. By mid-morning, the swamp was alive with men. Riders pushed through the underbrush, cursing, their horses lathered with sweat. They fired blindly into the thickets, musket balls whistling through the air. The dogs crashed through the reeds, snapping at shadows. Joseph doubled back through stagnant pools, wading waist-deep, letting the water erase his scent. His body was a map of pain, lashes torn open again, muscles screaming, but his mind was a blade, cold and focused. By afternoon, the hounds were confused, spinning in circles, their voices ragged. The men began to quarrel among themselves, nerves fraying in the heat. Every rustle of leaves made them flinch. The swamp had become Joseph's ally, swallowing him whole. But he knew this was only the first day. Word would spread beyond the plantation. By nightfall, the county would know. By the week's end, posters would bloom on every post and crossroads. Wanted, Joseph Carter. Dead or alive. The weight of a bounty would draw hunters from miles away, men who saw nothing but the promise of coin. Joseph paused on a ridge of dry ground as the sun bled down through the trees, turning the water copper red. He could still hear the distant clatter of hooves, the crack of branches. He knew they would not stop. They would chase him until they were sure he was either in chains or buried. And yet, standing there soaked in swamp water, breath heaving, he felt something dangerously close to peace. Not safety, there was none of that. But freedom, raw and feral, in the space between heartbeats. He had no plan beyond this hour. No map. No allies he could trust. Only the fire in his chest and the taste of open air. For years they had made him live like an animal. Now he would survive like one. The sun sank. The first stars pierced the sky, cold and sharp. Joseph turned north, into the dark. His legs trembled, but he moved with a strange quiet power, like the earth itself had decided to carry him. Behind him, the plantation still howled, a broken empire thrashing in its own blood. Ahead, the wilderness opened wide and endless. They had taken everything from him: his name, his blood, his years. Tonight, he had taken something back. And though the price would be high, though the world would hunt him like a beast, he did not regret it. Joseph Carter walked deeper into the night, and with every step, the chains on his soul fell silent. The night Joseph disappeared, the air hung heavy with the smell of wet moss and fear. Rain had swept across the Carolina lowlands all afternoon, turning the earth into a black sponge. By dusk, the hounds had lost his scent, circling aimlessly at the edge of the swamp as if they sensed something unnatural waiting beyond the cypress trees. The men who had once called themselves his masters stood under dripping hats, shouting orders, their voices cracking like brittle branches. But Joseph Carter was already slipping beyond their world, into a place they would never truly enter. He moved like a phantom through the flooded marshes, his breath ragged, his legs raw from thorn and mud. Behind him, the plantation lay in disarray, fires still smoldering where he had struck, shadows running wild through the fields, chains lying empty on the ground like shed skins. He did not look back. He could not. He knew that if he stopped, even for one heartbeat, the terror would catch him, not from the men behind him but from the echo of all the years they had stolen. So he pressed deeper into the swamp, where the moonlight dissolved and the air thickened to silence. For weeks, there were sightings. A hat left on a riverbank. A deer snared and gutted as if by invisible hands. At night, the dogs would bay and then retreat, tails between their legs, refusing to go farther. The masters grew restless. Their world, once so absolute, was cracking at the edges. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cane fields made them flinch. They spoke his name in whispers, Joseph Carter, as if saying it aloud might summon him from the darkness. Some claimed he had drowned in the bog, swallowed whole. Others swore they had seen him standing among the cypress knees, watching with eyes like burning coal. Time passed, and the search parties dwindled. The swamp reclaimed its secrets. But the whispers never stopped. They began as murmurs among the enslaved, carried from cabin to cabin like smuggled fire. They spoke of a man who had defied the lash, who had stared into the eyes of his oppressor and not blinked. They told how he vanished into the night, how no bullet could catch him, no hound could track him, how he walked barefoot over snake nests and never bled. Mothers began to hush crying children by saying, "Sleep now, or Joseph will come," but their eyes gleamed with quiet pride. To them, he was no longer merely a man, he was proof. Proof that chains could break, that fear could be unlearned. Even the masters began to fear the story they could not kill. They boarded up the overseer's house where Joseph had struck the final blow. No one would walk beneath the ancient oak where the body had hung. Travelers reported that horses spooked and bolted when nearing that place, as if some invisible current rippled through the air. The oak stood there still, its bark blackened, its limbs gnarled like clutching hands. Some swore they saw ropes swinging in the breeze, though there was nothing there. Years turned to decades. The plantation rotted away. Weeds burst through the cracked bricks, and wild vines coiled around the empty windows. But the legend only grew. Hunters spoke of a figure slipping between trees at twilight, tall and gaunt, wearing the tatters of a cotton shirt from another century. Fishermen heard footsteps pacing the banks at night, long after all living things had gone still. They called him the Ghost Rebel, the one who rose against the whip and never bowed, who dissolved into the swamp and became part of it. No grave was ever found. No bones. No sign that Joseph Carter had ever died at all. Some say he waits, watching. That every man who tries to take what isn't his, who dares to lay hands on the innocent, will one day hear branches creak behind him in the dead of night. And when he turns, there will be nothing but the faint sway of rope from a tree that should be still. On humid summer nights, when the air hums with insects and the Spanish moss hangs low like curtains, you can still stand at the edge of that old plantation and feel him. Not see, not hear, feel. A pressure on your chest, as if the swamp itself is holding its breath. As if the darkness is leaning closer to listen. Those who linger too long say the wind carries a voice, rough and low, whispering words they cannot quite catch, words that crawl into their bones and do not leave. Joseph Carter vanished into the swamps, but he never left. And so his story walks on, barefoot and silent, beneath the crooked branches of the oak. A reminder carved in shadow, that freedom taken by blood is never truly lost. That sometimes a single spark, once lit, can burn long after the man who struck it is gone. They say the past never truly dies, it lingers, like smoke in old wood. The swamp has gone quiet now. The fields are gone, the mansion crumbled to dust, yet if you stand where the oak tree still twists against the sky, you can almost hear him. Not the sound of chains, not the crack of the whip, but something softer, the steady beat of a heart that refused to break. Joseph Carter's name was never carved into stone. History books didn't record his face. But the price he paid still echoes in every gust of wind that stirs the Spanish moss. He fought not for glory, not even for revenge, but for the simple, terrifying idea that no human soul is born to kneel. And that kind of courage, born from pain, sharpened by silence, leaves marks deeper than any monument. Freedom, real freedom, has always been written in blood. And often, it is written by those the world tries hardest to erase. Remember Joseph Carter, not as a ghost, not as a legend, but as a man who chose to stand when standing meant dying. If his story stirred something in you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Share it. Keep it alive. Because somewhere, even now, someone else is standing at their own oak tree, deciding whether to rise. And if you want more untold stories like this, stories that haunt, challenge, and inspire, subscribe to this channel. The past is still whispering. Listen closely,